Didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stood in the kitchen doorway watching my mother write a check for my brother's tuition and told myself I would remember this moment for the rest of my life. I was 22. I had been accepted into the nursing program at Dalhousie. I had the acceptance letter printed out, sitting on the kitchen table between the butter dish and the fruit bowl, because I thought maybe if they could see it, physically see it, it would feel real to them the way it felt real to me. My mother glanced at it. My father said, "We'll talk about it later." They never did. What they talked about for weeks was my brother's business idea. He was 24 and wanted to open a gym. Not a franchise, not a plan with a financial advisor, just a gym. He had a logo and a playlist and a lot of confidence, and somehow that was enough. My parents sat at that same kitchen table and went through every number with him. Startup costs, equipment leasing, month-to-month projections. My father had a yellow legal pad. My mother made tea. It looked like a board meeting I hadn't been invited to. I want to be careful here because I spent years trying to convince myself I was misremembering, that I was being dramatic, that there was some reasonable explanation I was too young or too emotional to understand. But I've gone back over it so many times in so many quiet moments, and the truth is what it is. They looked at my brother's dream and saw something worth protecting. They looked at mine and said, "We don't have the money." They had the money, they just didn't have it for me. My mother's explanation, the one time she gave it, was that nursing was practical and I would find a way. "You're resourceful," she said, and she meant it as a compliment. My brother needed their help because entrepreneurship was risky. I was being sent out into the world alone because I was capable of surviving it. I nodded and went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The student loans I could get were not enough to cover residence and tuition both. I deferred my acceptance for a year, moved into a basement apartment in Halifax with 2 other girls, and worked doubles at a family restaurant on Quinpool Road until my feet stopped hurting at night because they had simply given up registering it. I reapplied for more funding. I wrote letters. I called the financial aid office so many times the coordinator knew my name and the particular cadence of my sighing. I got in the following September. I did it without them. I want to say the first year was triumphant. It wasn't. It was fluorescent lighting and 12-hour clinical shifts and eating peanut butter out of the jar over the sink because I didn't have time to make real food. It was calling my grandmother on Sunday nights because she was the only person in the family who asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. It was learning, slowly, that I was good at this, not just passing grades good, actually good. My supervisors said so. My patients said so. An elderly man on the cardiac ward once grabbed my hand and said, "You're the kind of nurse that makes people feel less alone." And I went into the supply closet afterward and cried for about 4 minutes, and then went back out and finished my shift. I graduated 3 years later with my BSCN and a job offer from the Nova Scotia Health Authority before I even had the gown off. I called my parents. My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey. The way you say it when someone tells you they found a good parking spot." My brother's gym had closed by then. Not enough members, too much overhead, something about the HVAC system, and my father had quietly written off the loss. No one mentioned it directly. In my family, things that didn't work out simply stopped being discussed. I moved into a 1-bedroom in Dartmouth. I bought furniture, real furniture, not curb finds, not things left behind by previous tenants. I bought a bed frame and a proper couch and a small dining table with 2 chairs, and I sat at that table on my first morning in that apartment and drank coffee in the silence and felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My social life rebuilt itself slowly. I met a friend group through a colleague at the hospital, a loose collection of nurses, a paramedic named Fiona, a few teachers who lived nearby, and on Friday nights we would rotate apartments and cook elaborate meals that nobody had the skill to pull off, but we tried anyway. I learned to make risotto at 11 p.m. on a Friday, surrounded by people who were cheering me on. It was small and ordinary, and it was mine. I dated. I had a relationship that lasted 2 years and ended without bitterness, which I consider a real accomplishment. I advanced at work. I moved into a senior clinical role. I started occasionally supervising students, and I thought sometimes about the woman I'd been at 22. Printing out an acceptance letter and putting it on the kitchen table, and I wanted to reach back and tell her something. I was never sure what exactly. Probably just keep going. My parents and I had a relationship technically, holiday dinners, occasional calls. My father's retirement party, which I attended and at which my mother told a table of their friends that I was a nurse, gesturing at me like I was an item on a menu she'd recommended. My brother had started another business by then. Something in real estate, vague and optimistic, and my parents were involved in that too, financing and advising the whole familiar machinery. I didn't discuss it with them. There was nothing to discuss it. What had happened, and I had built my life from it, and the version of me who needed something from them had long since stopped waiting by the door. Then my brother announced his engagement. Her name was Simone. She was warm and funny and completely baffling to me in the way that people who genuinely love difficult people are always a little baffling. She had grown up in Moncton, worked in urban planning, had strong opinions about transit infrastructure, and absolutely terrible opinions about which condiments belonged on a hot dog. I liked her. I didn't say that out loud very much, but I did. The wedding was in August, outside Halifax, at a vineyard property in the Annapolis Valley. The kind of venue that shows up on Instagram with string lights and cedar tables and everyone wearing linen. My parents handled a significant portion of the cost. I heard this not from them, but from my aunt, who mentioned it the way people mention things they assume you already know. I bought a new dress. Navy blue, simple, not the kind of thing that announces itself. I drove out the morning of and arrived early enough to help with some of the setup because Simone had asked me and I wanted to be useful. The ceremony was outdoors, looking out over the vineyards. It was a genuinely beautiful evening, the kind of late summer light that makes everything look like it's been restored. I stood with the guests and watched my brother and Simone exchange rings and felt genuinely happy for them. Whatever my family had done or not done, Simone hadn't done any of it. She deserved this. The reception moved inside after the ceremony. Long tables, candles, cedar, exactly as advertised. I was seated with my aunt and two of my brother's friends, and a couple I didn't know who had driven up from New Brunswick. Dinner was good, wine was poured, speeches were made, and then, about an hour into the reception, the doors near the back of the room opened and the wedding photographer came in with a small team, and with him was his business partner, who he introduced briefly to the event coordinator. And I looked up from my conversation and went completely still. I knew him, not from my family, not from Halifax, not from anything in that room. I knew him from Dalhousie. From my first clinical year, from a ward on the 4th floor of the QEII where I had been a nursing student and he had been the administrator who had falsified a patient incident report, a report I had quietly documented at personal cost with no certainty that anything would come of it. I had given the documentation to my supervisor. I had been told it was being handled. I had never heard what happened after that. It was one of those things you do because it is right and then learn to let go of, because holding on to the outcome would hollow you out. He had not seen me yet. He was across the room laughing at something completely at ease. I turned back to my table and kept my face very still. My mother appeared at my elbow a few minutes later, the way she sometimes did at family events, materializing beside me in a way that felt performative. A demonstration of maternal attentiveness for whoever might be watching. "Isn't this lovely?" she said. "It is," I said. She looked out over the room. "Your brother did well." I nodded. "You should mingle more," she said. "You always sit in corners at these things." I looked at her. "I'm at a table. It's dinner." She made a small sound and moved on. The photographer's partner, I'll call him by his role because that's all he ever was to me, made his way around the room slowly, checking in with the event coordinator, examining the lighting setup. At one point he passed close enough to my table that I could have spoken to him. I didn't. I had nothing to say to him. Whatever had happened after I filed that documentation was not my story to tell in someone else's wedding. But then he reached the table where my parents were sitting. I watched my mother extend her hand. I watched them exchange the particular kind of pleasantries people exchange at events when they don't know each other, but are united by proximity to someone they do. And then I saw the moment. I can't describe it as anything other than a moment, when something shifted in his face. He had looked across the room. He had seen me. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't drop anything. He didn't make a scene. But the color changed. That's the only way I can put it. He was there, and then some essential presence left his face, and what remained was a calculation I recognized because I had once been on the other side of it, a person trying to determine the precise nature of a risk. My mother noticed. Of course she did. She followed his eye line and looked at me and looked back at him. "Do you know my daughter?" He said something. I was too far away to hear it. My mother came to me 15 minutes later, this time with a different quality of attention. She pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat down, and the couple from New Brunswick took that as their cue to refresh their drinks. "That man says he knows you," she said. "From the hospital." "Probably," I said. "I've worked in the system for a while." She was quiet for a moment. "He seemed, I don't know, strange when I mentioned your name." I said nothing. "He asked if you were still at the QEI. "No," I said. "I've been at Dartmouth General for 2 years." She looked at me for a long moment. It was not a comfortable look. It was the look of someone revising something they thought they understood. "What happened between you two?" she asked. "Nothing between us," I said, which was true. I reported something I observed. I did my job. My mother's hands were on the table and she looked at them. "He's the photographer Stuart hired." "I know. This is a problem." "It's not my problem," I said, "and it's not yours, it's his." She opened her mouth and closed it. Then she said slowly, "You could have told us you were. I didn't know you were involved in anything like that." "You didn't ask," I said. "You never asked." That landed differently than I intended, or maybe exactly as I intended, I'm not sure even now. My mother straightened in her chair. "I know we weren't always," she started. "I'm not doing this here," I said. Not unkindly. I genuinely was not trying to make her feel bad at my brother's wedding. I just meant what I said. "This is Stuart and Simone's night, let's just let it be that." She nodded after a moment. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and went back to her table. The photographer's partner left about an hour later. I don't know whether he was asked to go or whether he made that decision himself. The lead photographer stayed and finished the job, and the night moved on into dancing and cake, and the particular looseness of a celebration winding down. My brother hugged me at the end of the night and said, "I'm glad you were here," and I think he meant it, and I meant it when I said the same back. I drove home along the 101 as the valley fell away behind me. The highway dark and the sky enormous the way it gets out there. And I thought about my mother's face in that moment of revision. The way something had adjusted. The way she had looked at me and seen, briefly, a person she had not fully known. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me, a little, because I thought I might. But what I actually felt was tired and clear, the way you feel after a long shift when you finally sit down and the noise stops. She called me the following Tuesday. Not to apologize exactly. My mother doesn't operate in apologies, she operates in adjacencies. But she called, which was not nothing. We talked for 40 minutes about ordinary things, and at one point she said, out of nowhere, "I think your father and I should have handled things differently when you were starting out." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You turned out well anyway." I said, "I turned out well because of what I did, not in spite of what you didn't do." There was a long pause. "That's fair," she said. We hung up and I stood in my kitchen for a moment. Outside it was raining, that particular fine Halifax rain that isn't quite mist and isn't quite drizzle, just a persistent gray softness. My kettle was boiling. The apartment was warm. I had not needed a rescue. I had not needed a cheque or a cosigner or a seat at the table where the yellow legal pad lived. I had needed someone to believe I was worth the investment, and when no one offered that, I had found a way to believe it myself. That was the whole story. That was all of it. I made my tea and sat at my little table with the 2 chairs and listened to the rain. I keep thinking about that drive home along the 101. The valley behind me, the sky open, the highway dark. I wasn't replaying the night looking for victories. I was just sitting with the quiet the way you do after a shift when the adrenaline finally lets go, and what's left is just you and whatever you actually are underneath all of it. What I know now, and couldn't have articulated at 22 standing in that kitchen doorway, is that the way people treat you reveals something true about them. That the way you respond reveals something true about them. But the way you respond reveals something true about you. My parents made a choice. It was unfair. I'm not going to dress that up. They had the money and they decided my brother's dream was worth more than mine. And that decision cost me years of peanut butter dinners and exhausted mornings and loan applications written in the margins of clinical notes. That part was real and it mattered, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect, not in a mystical way, just in the plain, observable way of someone who has watched enough people in enough difficult moments. The things that are done to us set the conditions, but they don't write the ending. I had to become someone who could sit in a basement apartment in Halifax and decide, without anyone's permission, that I was worth the investment. That decision, that specific, quiet, unglamorous decision, is the one everything else grew from. The man at the wedding went pale because he recognized me as someone who had done the right thing when it would have been much easier not to. I hadn't done it for him. I hadn't even done it for myself, exactly. I'd done it because there was a patient whose experience deserved accurate documentation. And I was the person in the room who understood that. That's what integrity actually looks like in practice. It's not a grand speech. It's a form, filed correctly, at personal cost, with no guarantee of outcome. It's choosing to be the kind of person you can live with when the room empties out. And the intelligence it took to get there? Not test scores, but the real kind. The kind that knows how to read a situation clearly and act without letting emotion override judgment, that came from being left to figure things out alone. I didn't choose that curriculum, but I graduated from it. The grit was the same. 8 years of early shifts and student loan statements and cooking rice in a pot because the colander had broken and I hadn't gotten around to replacing it. 8 years of showing up specifically and consistently to a life I was building with no cosigner. That's not a story about suffering. It's a story about what happens when you keep going anyway, not because you're fearless, but because stopping would mean becoming someone you don't recognize. My mother said I turned out well. I think what she meant was that she was surprised. And maybe that's enough? Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but a beginning of something more honest than what we had before. I made my tea. I sat at my table. Outside, it was raining. That was enough.